So my name is Rachel Streib. I did my thesis on the knowledge and attitudes of the United States criminal justice system. So my first slide contains a QR code for the handout I did. Honestly, I can pass around it as well because I have extras, but I'll give you a second to scan that code. So first off, I want to talk about the importance of the current study. So there has been a 500% increase in the population in the United States over the last 40 years. This increase is due to the policies enacted by public officials. And who elects those public officials? We as citizens do. And the citizens of the United States elect public officials based on their knowledge about current issues, as well as how they feel about not only the politicians, but those issues as well. So it's very important to discover how much the general population actually knows about the criminal justice system, and as well as the attitudes for or towards offenders, as well as the criminal justice system, because that will impact who they elect in office. For my literature review, I will be going over 5 different studies. The first 2 go over knowledge, specifically what sources the general public turns to get their information on crime. And then the last 3 will focus on attitudes, specifically punitive attitudes towards crime or towards offenders. And it will be broken down by the variables that I researched, which would be political affiliation and gender. So the first article is The Public's Misunderstanding of Crime Policy, The Effects of Criminal Justice Experience in Media Reliance by J.T. Pickett. The main goal of this article was to understand why there is a gap in the public's knowledge about the criminal justice system. And he conducted his interview through telephone. So he interviewed 1,308 Florida residents. And there was 3 main findings from this study. The first one was that those with prior criminal justice experience didn't rely as heavily on the media to get their information on crime. Along with this, he also found that those with prior criminal justice experience, so criminal justice experience meaning they were offenders themselves, they know someone who was an offender, they work in corrections, they work as an officer, a judge, things of that nature. They also found those with prior criminal justice experience knew more about criminal punishment. And the third finding from the study was that the general public that did rely on the media to get their information about crime had lower knowledge levels, so those with no criminal justice experience. On the same note, the second article, which is the news media influence on criminal justice policy, how market-driven news promotes punitiveness, is by Sarah Sun Beal. And the main goal of this article was to prove that there are outside forces that are determining what the news covers when it comes to crime. So, and because of this, essentially, news coverage has played a major role in reshaping the public's opinion and ultimately public policy on crime. And she did this through completing a review of previous research. In one of the articles she cited was by the American Bar Association, and they conducted a poll and asked respondents to identify important sources of information they turn to for information on the criminal justice system. So in this poll, 41% identified TV news as an important source they relied on. 37% identified news magazines as an important source that they rely on, and 36% identified local newspapers as an important source that they relied on. The same respondents also stated they believe the news to report honest and accurate information. So they believe what they are consuming. And as we saw with the Pickett article, based off that, they don't know because they don't have any experience with the criminal justice system directly. So the information they're being provided may not always be accurate, but they believe it to be. The third article turns to attitude. So it is going to be Beyond Public Opinion Polls, a Punitive Public Sentiment in Criminal Justice Policy by Natasha Frost. And this looks at both political affiliation and gender associated with punitive attitudes. And it is a survey article on punitiveness in public opinions. So what Frost does first is she describes 3 different models that aim to explain the relationship between public punitiveness and punitive justice policy. The first one was the democracy at work theory. The second one was the penal populism theory. And the third one was the elite manipulation theory. The one we're going to talk about a little bit is the third one, elite manipulation, because it ties into the knowledge articles. So basically, this theory states that there are outside forces that are influencing what the media covers for crime, and those outside forces are politicians. So they feed the media what they want to push in order to hit things on their agenda paths, especially in relation to crime. In the same Frost article, or in the same Frost review, she cites a study conducted by Costello and colleagues. And this study found that conservatives are more likely to support punitive responses to crime, regardless on how punitiveness is measured. And this is due to conservatives tending to attribute crime to the individual's own decision to violate the law, while liberals, on the other hand, are more likely to attribute the crime to deficits in the individual's environment, meaning it's more of a social issue. They're not committing the crime because they want to, but because they have to. Whereas conservatives believe you're doing the crime just to do it. Once again, in the same Frost review, she cites a study done by Applegate and colleagues, and this found that women, Black people, and younger people are less punitive than men, white people, and older people. And this study also found that women are less likely to support the death penalty and more punitive measures, and are more likely to support a rehabilitative orientation and punishment. The next article we'll talk about is The Social Sources of Americans' Punitiveness, a test of 3 competing models by James Honever and Francis Cullen. This study started off by the researchers describing 3 main theories that aim to provide an explanation for punitive attitudes, which is the escalated crime distrust model, the moral decline model, and the racial animus model. So they briefly went over the 3 of those, but the important piece of this is the researchers wanted to assess the degree to which the theories added to the understanding of why Americans endorse punitive crime control policies. And their study had 2 main findings. The first one being that across all 3 models, political orientation impacted punitiveness. And also what they found was those who identified as conservative politically were more likely to endorse punitive policies, including the use of death penalty in both adult and adolescent offenders. And the last study we're going to talk about is the public views towards crime and correctional policies. Is there a gender gap? By Brandon Applegate, Francis Cullen, and Bonnie Fisher. This study was done to identify gender differences in regards to punitiveness. And the 3 researchers conducted their interview by sending out questionnaires to 1,000 Ohio residents. And what their study found was that 12% more women than men chose rehabilitation in a form of punishment. And that split was even larger when it came to gender differences between capital punishment. So their study found that 64% of female respondents favored the death penalty, compared to the 82% of their male respondents who favored the death penalty. So although those numbers are both still high, it does show that in this study, 18% more men favored the death penalty than women. So that is the literature review portion. Next is going to be my empirical questions. I did have 4 of them. The first one is, what is the level of knowledge among citizens about corrections in the United States? The second one is, are there differences in knowledge by gender and political affiliation? Is knowledge level related to punitive attitudes? And if yes, does it vary by gender and political affiliation? For my study, I did run a 2x3 factorial between subjects designed with non-repeated measures, and I did include a table here that broke it down, so you can see exactly what I was looking at. And for my methods, I did have a total of 126 participants. 4 were removed for the study for providing incomplete data. So what that means is they identified as a gender that I did not look at, or a political affiliation that I did not look at, so they were removed. I did break it down further by the females and their political affiliation, and the males and their political affiliation. For my independent variables, I did have 2. My first one was gender, and that was broken down further into female and male. And then the second one I looked at was political affiliation, which is broken down by Democrat, Republican, and Independent. And through the rest of the study, those will be abbreviated and shown as MD, MR, MI, FD, FR, and FI for short. For my dependent variables, the first one was a knowledge test, and this was used to gauge how much each participant actually knew about the criminal justice system, and it was 25 true-false questions. And I did provide some examples below here. So the second one we'll just read is President Obama was the first sitting president to visit a federal prison. As you can see, that's bold, black T. That means it's true. So he was the first president to visit a federal prison. And to give everyone a whole score, I divided their total score by 25. And my next dependent variable was an attitude test. This was used to gauge how each participant feels about the criminal justice system. And it was 14 Likert scale questions, ranging from 1 being strongly agree to 6 being strongly disagree. And then I did include example questions as well. So for instance, the second one, American taxpayers should not have to pay for prisons. They would say 1 to 6, depending on how they feel, and move on to the next question. What is important about the attitude test, though, is that it was designed so if someone's scores are lower, they are viewed as more pro-prisoner, and if their scores are higher, they are viewed as more pro-punishment. So the lowest score you could get was a 14. Anywhere between a 14 to 42, they were in the pro-prisoner category, and anywhere between 43 and the highest score you could get, which was 84, they'd be labeled as pro-punishment. This is not my results portion yet, but I did want to provide the mean scores for everyone. So I'll break it down for you. So starting on the left, I did provide the mean scores for my knowledge test, including all genders and all political affiliations. So with the solid blue bar, that is going to be male Democrats. The solid red bar is going to be male Republicans, and the solid purple bar is going to be male independents. Next, moving to the pattern bars, the dotted blue bar is going to be female Democrats. The dotted red bar is going to be female Republicans, and the dotted purple bar is going to be female independents. And it's the same thing on the other side for attitudes as well. But for knowledge, you can see that both female Democrats and male Democrats have the same knowledge score for a mean of 71, and the lowest was going to be female Republicans and female independents with 68. For attitudes, you are looking for a lower score to show more pro-prisoner views, and you can see female Democrats had the lowest score of 33.5, and female Republicans had the highest average score of 43.5. So they would be in that pro-punishment category. I did break it down by just gender alone. So it looks very askewed here, but it's not. For mean scores of knowledge, males had an average score of 70 and females had an average score of 69. For attitudes, females had an average score of 38.19 and males had an average score of 40.42. So based on gender, they'd both be in the pro-prisoner category. And then for just political affiliation, the striped blue bar is going to be Democrats, the striped red bar is Republicans, and the striped purple bar is going to be independents. And the Democrats did have the highest mean score, and the Republicans had the highest attitude score, being very pro-punishment. For my results portion, I did run a t-test to sample assuming equal variances to find my answers. For the attitude for the knowledge portion, I did not find anything statistically significant between both political affiliation and gender combined, political affiliation on its own, or gender on its own. But what I did find statistically significant will all be in the attitude portion. So starting off with female Democrats on the right were reported more pro-prisoner views than male Democrats on the left, with a p-value of 0.03. My next result also showed female Democrats reported more pro-prisoner views than, in this time, male Republicans on the left, with a p-value of 0.003. My next finding, once again, showed that female Democrats reported more pro-prisoner views than, this time, male independents on the left, with a p-value of 0.01. And this was my most statistically significant finding, which was female Democrats reported more pro-prisoner views than female Republicans, with a p-value of 0.000005, so very significant. And this one is the last one that looks at both political affiliation and gender, which shows that female Democrats on the left reported more pro-prisoner views than female independents on the right, with a p-value of 0.01. This then looks at all political affiliation, So I did find that all Democrats reported more pro-prisoner views than all Republicans, with a p-value of 0.0001. And lastly, I found that all Democrats reported more pro-prisoner views than all independents, with a p-value of 0.01. For the discussion portion, I just wanted to hit on the key points that I had. So female and male Democrats did have the highest knowledge mean score of 71. Female Republicans and female independents had the lowest score on knowledge with a 68. Female Democrats reported the most pro-prisoner views with an average attitude score of 33.5. Female Republicans had the most pro-punishment views with an attitude test mean of 43.5, so they would be in that pro-punishment category. I didn't find anything statistically significant for knowledge, and all Democrats reported more pro-prisoner views on the attitude test than both Republicans and independents. For my limitations, I did have a few. So I did have a limited sample size of 126 participants, and 4 of those had to be excluded for providing incomplete data. I did have a very skewed sample as well. So there were far more females that filled out my survey than there were males, which would be another study to look at. And limited exposure. So due to COVID, the questionnaires had to be dispersed electronically. I wasn't able to get in-person signatures, so that hindered how many participants I was able to get. For future research, I would be interested in not only looking at gender and political affiliation, but I would be interested to see if religious affiliation has any effect on putative attitudes and knowledge levels of the criminal justice system, as well as education levels, and I would like to see if race has an effect on that as well. When I was completing my research for my study, I did find a lot on education levels, and essentially they did state the higher education you have, the more progressive your views will be, but it changes if you're a criminal justice student. So those students actually have more pro-punishment views and were more punitive towards offenders. So I'd be interested in looking at that in the future. Any questions?
Fang-Mei, you have any questions? You still have Fang-Mei?
What? Yeah, I'm here.
Do you have any questions for Rachel?
I thought, Rachel, you did a very good job to compare, different groups. I'm just wonder, you never try to see if you can use ANOVA to test rather than independent t-test?
I was just going on the advisement of Dr. Victor.
Oh, listen to me. She was looking at group data, and we just want to quick and easy down and dirty.
Okay. I just that sometimes in the statistics we can do one way ANOVA first, and then if they are different, then we can further down. But then looks like you took the way you just compare each group. So that's another way. I'm just wonder. So maybe next time we can try to see, if your result will be different. But I think you explained very clear and detailed. Just one suggestion: next time when you do the PowerPoint, those color you may want to label inside the slide so we can see it. What color mean for which group is easier, because after you say it, I may forget like which one is which. So that's my suggestion.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions?
The only thing I noticed is that the PowerPoint left off the asterisks, which is significant findings too.
Did I?
Yeah. Oh, I noticed it, but
I thought I put them with the p-value.
on the title of your slides. See?
Oh,
But it's there. Oh yeah, and I didn't even title of the slide of the.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I did forget that.
Oh, that's perfect. I'm happy to put too. I'm sure she's glad to be done.
Yeah.
How do you feel?
Great.
Sage, you go to stage. Yeah. That's cool. You're gonna buy it? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, Rachel. You need everything, and your PowerPoint and your Sage. Yeah. Where'd you put that where it says all, what was it? All equal percentages, all equal, that's what it was, all that stuff, you'll see. Sam, did you have any questions? No, I'm done.
We're done with Rachel.
Okay, let me turn it off.